Well, many regions of the world are home to ailments that largely affect their own populace. And such is true for an ailment called Behçet's disease, also known as Silk Road disease, because it predominantly is found around old silk trading routes in the Middle East and Central Asia, all the way to Japan. Here to share some insight on what that disease is and how it's treated is Dr. Elliot Rosenstein, Director of the Institute for Rheumatic Autoimmune Diseases at Overlook Medical Center. Thanks for taking the time to join us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
This is something we don't hear about much here in the U.S., Behçet's disease, but it's pretty common in the Middle East.
That's right. In the U.S., there are only about 10 to 20,000 people that have the condition, but it's much more common in the Middle East, in Central Asia, and Japan.
Mm-hmm. How do you diagnose something like this? As I understand, it takes on a lot of different forms.
It takes on a lot of different forms, but there's one characteristic that's almost universal in all people that have the condition, and that is recurrent sores in the inside of the mouth, very much like canker sores.
Mm-hmm. Visual problems as well?
That's right. Eyes are commonly affected about 50% of the time, and it's just not nuisance symptoms, but sometimes it can lead to blindness.
Mm-hmm. So how do you diagnose this? What are the first symptoms you generally will see?
Well, it's not easy, and the first thing is you have to be suspicious of it, and if somebody comes from an ethnic group where the condition is more common, as you alluded to, the suspicion is higher, but it can affect anybody. So one looks for the common manifestations being the oral involvement. Mm-hmm. Also common manifestations are genital involvement, skin lesions, very characteristic skin lesions, something called folliculitis, and another condition called erythema nodosum. These have characteristic findings that dermatologists or rheumatologists would know how to recognize. Mm-hmm. The eye involvement that you mentioned can also affect blood vessels in different parts of the body, central nervous system, lungs.
So this is something that can have far bigger implications down the road.
For most people, it's a relatively benign condition, but for some people, it can be life-threatening.
Mm-hmm. So I would imagine you would urge people who are from Middle Eastern regions, perhaps Japanese, Central Asian regions, if they have complications like this, to seek out somebody who might be familiar with this?
That's right. In particular, the oral lesions. So if somebody has bouts of canker sores frequently, generally 3 bouts per year, that's the kind of situation where you would want to bring it to the attention of oral surgeon, internists, dermatologist. Depending on the other manifestations, you might bring your symptoms to the attention of an ophthalmologist, gastroenterologist, because it can also affect the GI tract.
Okay.
But rheumatologists are mainly the ones that treat it.
Is this common among children, or is this an adult related disease?
For the most part, it's an adult disease, a young adult disease. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't know any age bounds.
Okay, but primarily, would you say 20s to 30s maybe?
Exactly.
Okay. Now, you know, a lot of things we hear about here in the U.S., you get immediate reaction from the pharmaceutical industry because there's big bucks in treatment. But you don't hear that going on as much in other parts of the world. Is this one of those cases where there is not as much focus on treatment?
Well, it's hard to do studies of a condition that occurs rarely. This is what's called an orphan disease, a disease that there are so few people that it's very hard for a pharmaceutical company to do a well-designed study involving thousands of patients across many centers. Mm-hmm. So these diseases tend to get neglected, and what we do is try to apply the information that we have from other diseases to this disease. Because this is an inflammatory disease, we use medications that we use to treat other inflammatory disease to treat this.
Right. So it is treatable?
It's very much treatable. I wouldn't say it's curable. Until we really know what causes it, it's going to be hard to find a cure. Mm-hmm. But we certainly have medications that can treat all the different manifestations.
Are there things that people who are affected can do at home to perhaps minimize the effects, the frequency of the canker sores, that kind of thing?
Not so much the frequency, but certainly the intensity of the pain. So there are local measures that one can take to try to minimize the pain. But until we figure out, is there an infection that's leading to this? Is this primarily a genetic disorder? It's going to be hard for anybody to do something on a prophylactic basis, on a preventative basis, to try to minimize their symptoms.
Now, is this something easily passable, like a common cold, or is this something that's more internal?
Infections have been implicated, but there's really no good data that this condition can be spread from one person to another.
Interesting stuff. And again, this is not something you see commonly in the U.S., so I would imagine difficult to find someone who's familiar with treatment.
There are only certain centers in the U.S., there are about 3 in the U.S. that are really specializing in the treatment of Behçet's. I have to compliment you on your pronunciation of the condition because most Americans say Behçet's disease, like the jazz musician.
All right.
But in Turkish, I think it's actually Behçet's disease.
Oh, okay. Well, I shall pat myself on the back a little bit. But listen, thanks for coming in and sharing some insight with us. I'm sure there are members of our audience who will look and see, there's something to, now I know a little bit more about something that may impact family and friends, that kind of thing. A lot of an international audience for us, and perhaps people who travel back and forth might get something out of that. So
I hope so.